the best way to read it is maybe 3 verses at a time. As is said in the philosophy of Vedanta, if you can understand 1 verse of the Gita, 1 verse, you are instantly realized. All right, we're back with another reflection on the daily Vedantic, and here's something that I was saying to a friend. Today's reflection is built on a conversation I was having with a friend that's part of the Venice Vedanta Club here, and he's a really successful musician, total badass, and just not only a good friend, but really deep soul that inspires me on so many levels, creatively, professionally, thoughtfully, spiritually. And the conversation that we were having recently was around how to read the Gita. Part of the conversation was logistically to read it maybe a couple verses at a time. And I totally get the desire to read the whole thing. The Bhagavad Gita is like a 27-minute read, and I have a series, an 18-part series where I sum up a lesson from each chapter of the 18 chapters of the Gita. It is the world's most famous poem, and it is so awesome to read because it's this conversation between a warrior prince having an absolute meltdown, and he's having this conversation with his charioteer in the middle of this massive battlefield, right before this epic battle takes place of this civil war, 13 years in the making. And the prince was so gung-ho for 13 years, and then right before the battle is about to begin, and he sees how undermanned his side is, and he has a complete meltdown. And you get the 27-minute dialogue between him and his charioteer, who ends up being the symbolic embodiment of God. So it's this conversation with the world's most famous warrior prince that's been so gung-ho for this battle, and now it's here. And he's freaking out, breaking down. And we get to read this conversation between this warrior prince and the symbolic embodiment of God. Quite the setting for any text, much less a spiritual text, a philosophical text. So when people hear that, there's a natural curiosity to want to read it, especially in the West, where it was only translated into English about 200 years ago. It's a 2,500-year-old poem, and in the West, we just haven't had it for very long. Within a few decades of it being translated into English, you had people like Emerson and Thoreau and Margaret Fuller, and you had these titans, Arthur Schopenhauer, that would read it daily. In fact, Thoreau said, in the early morning hours, I bathe my intellect with the cosmogonal philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. He said that in Walden. And the Boston Brahmins, the heart, soul, the beginning of American literature, they all, who call themselves the Boston Brahmins or the Transcendentalists, they all read the Gita each morning. So it has taken certain circles by storm because of that context I gave. And the natural question is how to approach something like this, because especially if you do indulge yourself, read the whole thing all the way through, and you do it in 30 minutes, you quickly realize, holy hell, this thing is like very paradoxical, very topsy-turvy, says one thing and then the next line says something that feels like the exact opposite. And how do you make sense of it all? Well, how to read it would be logistically, go ahead and rip through the whole thing to get a sense for it and get a sense for the lay of the land before you go deep. Then the best way to read it is maybe 3 verses at a time. As is said in the philosophy of Vedanta, if you can understand 1 verse of the Gita, 1 verse, you are instantly realized. Swami will take it further. I've mentioned this on the pod before, that Swami, he'll say at the ashram that if you can understand just 1 word of the Gita fully, then you're instantly realized. The word that always comes to mind for me whenever I say that out loud is samaha, which means sameness. Sameness joy, sorrow, pleasure, pain, if you can have a sameness in those, if you can have a sameness when you view a friend or an enemy, if you can have sameness when you view someone else and yourself, then that is the definition of self-realization. That is the changeless state. So you could also just focus on one word. You could buy, if you buy No Nicknames Gita on Amazon. It's just I sell these versions of the Gita that I took out. There's about 72 nicknames between the warrior prince and his charioteer, Arjuna and Krishna. They give each other a bunch of nicknames back and forth because they also were childhood friends. And it can kind of throw a reader for a loop. So I decided to print out a version that is just, with no nicknames, that is just the text. You could read it all the way through. And you could buy that. I sell it at cost on Amazon. You could buy that and just open it up and read a random verse every morning and reflect on it. The real 4 ways to read the Gita. Here's the outline for those 4 ways. There are the 2 main characters, Arjuna and Krishna. There's also 2 sub-characters that build out the narrative. Dhritarashtra, who's this blind king that's hearing the story from his council. And his council, Sanjaya, is telling him, hey, I have this ability to see from far away, and I'm witnessing this conversation, this dialogue between the opposing warrior prince, Arjuna, that you fear, that you revere, that you kind of want to know what is he thinking, and his charioteer, Krishna, which we all know. It's kind of like this really sage friend, neutral party between both sides, but really wise. So Dhritarashtra, the blind king, do you want to hear this conversation? And Dhritarashtra's like, yeah, of course, I want to hear that conversation. So Sanjaya is relaying the conversation. And what is interesting about these 4 perspectives is that that's how we read a transformational text like this. That's how we're called to read a transformational text like this. And the slight sidebar on that word transformational, so much of what we read is confirmational, just to confirm what we already think. The timeless texts that we have in humanity, these are the things that you don't read for confirmation. They don't make sense on the first read. And that's because to have it make sense requires us to transform. And that's why we read it. That's why humanity has kept it for so long. It's because it has the power to transform us. But that, by definition, means it might be perplexing at first. Because the version of you that's reading it and perplexed is ostensibly, if you really are pursuing it, not just mild curiosity, but pursuing transformation, that is the version of you that will be transformed into the version that understands it, which takes us to these 4 perspectives. Dhritarashtra is this blind king, symbolic of blind ambition, blind materialistic pursuit of the world. They are not the rightful kings. They're not the rightful heirs to the throne, but he wants it, and he's blind. Doesn't know what he's doing. Unwise actions destroy worlds. Sanjaya has a reference. No. Sanjaya has a reverence for Arjuna and Krishna. Dhritarashtra has a light curiosity. He wants to know what's happening, but he's going to do whatever he's going to do regardless. Sanjaya, who's watching it, who sees it, who has a reverence for these 2 main characters, is saying, hey, you better pay attention to this. Because Krishna, he never does anything wrong. So we better pay attention to this. The first perspective is, hey, let me read the Gita because, it's been around 2,500 years. I'm pretty blind in my ambitions in the world. I want a bunch of different things, and I want kind of material pursuits, but hey, I'm lightly curious, and it makes for a great dinner conversation, makes for a great cocktail, kind of peacock walking when I talk about knowing this or that about the Bhagavad Gita. Just want to know what happened in that conversation. That's Dhritarashtra. Then there's Sanjaya. It's like, oh, there's reference here. He's the scholar. He's reading it because he wants to know what's being said, what's really being said. That's a second perspective to read it. Not light, cursory curiosity, but an intellectual pursuit of understanding what's being said by both sides. Then there's Arjuna. You read it because there's a self-awareness of, holy shit, there is a battle going on in my heart. That's what this text is symbolically about, the battle that is raging within all of us between the mind and the intellect. That perspective, especially if you're in the midst of pain or you have voluntarily signed up for a big battle that you are moving towards and you're starting to freak out, that's the perspective. It's no longer intellectual curiosity. It's no longer a light worldly curiosity. It's no longer intellectual curiosity. At this point, you actually are just really trying to navigate, trying to figure out, trying to get wisdom out of this text because something is really painful. Pain in the midst of something raging inside of you, and you need guidance. It's a great place to read from because that is the self-awareness that very few of us, although it is quite helpful in the midst of a real physical battle, very few of us are in the midst of a physical battle. But every one of us is in the midst of a war that if we voluntarily, if we, with proper awareness, can look within ourselves, we see this war. Joseph Campbell often says that, who's a known Vedantin, secretary of the Vedanta Society of New York for a couple of years. In his famous text of Hero with 1,000 Faces, where he famously gives the hero's journey, the arc of nearly all stories, that timeless stories, that comes up in every story that we still see in modern culture and society. As he famously said, the treasure you seek is in the cave you least want to enter. Now, all of us can ignore the battle that's going on within us. You can suppress it, escape it. You can get 5 gin and tonics deep and not pay attention to it, but it's still there. The treasure you seek is in the cave you least want to enter, and it's when you get close to that cave, knowing you've got to enter it, or at least hearing this whisper of a call that you should enter it, that you should do what you ought to do, that you should rise to your responsibility, your obligation, to your capacity. You start to listen to that whisper, that's when you really need some guidance, because your knees start to buckle. I know this feeling so well. Put it off for 5 years knowing I probably should do that. And the call gets louder and louder. Never goes away. You can try to drown it out and it's still there. So you can read the Gita from Arjuna's perspective, and it is beautifully helpful. But ultimately, we're called to read the Gita from Krishna's perspective. At that point, when you arrive there, I say when because Krishna is an enlightened being, and in Vedanta, everyone will become enlightened. It is inevitable. When you're, as Alan Watts would say, when you're ready to wake up, you'll wake up. When you really want it, it's yours. It's all of our natural states. I cannot speak from experience. I can only speak from this philosophy, the philosophical perspective that every step is a step towards enlightenment. Every decision that you make, even if it's just exhausting all of these external terrestrial world options to realize, oh, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it. Those are all steps towards enlightenment. It is inevitable. And in that trek towards the inevitability, once you are at the Krishna level, you don't need the Gita, much less you don't need any philosophy. There is no philosophy. There is no Gita to read. But on our way there, it isn't just guidance and counsel. On our way there, that's the call, is to read it from his perspective. To not just read it because we need the guidance, but to read it because we recognize, holy hell, so many people in my community are suffering. I need to get to that point. Incrementally approach that perspective so that I can help guide those around me. You start to yearn for it. As Ramakrishna would say, yearning for it like someone being submerged underwater, yearning for oxygen. You yearn for it because you become so aware of how much suffering there is around us. You're not just yearning for the oxygen for yourself. You're seeing so many people around us drowning. You want to get that oxygen for them. Wherever someone might be, there is no wrong place to be. There's just a sequential higher and higher calling within a text like the Gita to get to that perspective. Well, to get beyond it, technically, beyond it all. Or so we're told. Like I said, I can't speak from experience on what that is like beyond it all, or in that Krishna perspective that sees and knows everything. But I can say I've gone through the first three, and it's immensely fascinating from just the secular curiosity. Immensely profound from the intellectual curiosity perspective, and immensely helpful from the personal perspective of Arjuna. So if you've never picked it up, I highly, highly recommend you checking it out. And you can also check out the 18-part series that I did with a lesson from each chapter. Because one of the things that is so clear in Arjuna needing a guide, and this is a very, very wise warrior prince that still needed a guide. This text needs guidance. And I am like, this is like caricature, entertainment guidance versus something like the 3-year course at the ashram, which you can tune into on the app, Vedanta World app. The real deal, the 3-year course at the ashram, 2 years of it is spent on this 30-minute conversation. So that shows you not just the depth, but how much importance is placed on the guidance through a text like this. But dip your toe in the water and see if it's for you. You can do that with the No Nicknames Gita. You can do that with Swami's Bhagavad Gita and his commentary, which when you finish the 30-minute version of my No Nicknames Gita, the last page is like, okay, now read this with commentary to see what's happening, what's really going on. And that's Swami's commentary. Or jump into the 3-year course. See if that speaks to you. Try it for 2-3 weeks and see if it speaks to you. That's today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.